So now that we've gone through and talked about what Grilling 101 is, and we've shown you some of the PowerPoint presentations, what we'd like to do now is just specifically give you more information about some of the cuts that are presented in the PowerPoint presentations, as well as a little bit more about ground beef as a whole, about nutrition of meat. So this is kind of like, we're going to go through what I call a steak and burger 101. These are really for you to go through and learn and kind of hear about, and then maybe when people ask you questions, you're more prepared to answer those questions as you go through. So let's talk about some of the selected beef cuts that are in the PowerPoint and what you might use when you're doing your Grilling 101. So when you do your Grilling 101, first of all, here we have a beef carcass. In this beef carcass, you'll see, if you look at the very top of the slide, that's where the round is. If you look at the very bottom, that's the chuck and the forearm of that carcass. And so the middle of the animal is what we call the middle meats. There are actually 4 major cuts in a beef carcass: the round, the loin, the rib, and the chuck. There's some minor primals or minor cuts that we call the flank, the brisket, and the foreshank. The plate is another one of those as you look through, but that's the major parts and minor parts of a beef carcass. Now let's look at our specific cuts. So let's look at our specific cuts as we go through here. First of all, a flank steak is one of those cuts out of the 6 that are in the PowerPoint presentation. A flank steak is from the flank, pretty easy, it's a steak. It's actually a fairly expensive steak if you notice the price per pound on this, and I pulled this off just the website. These prices are not necessarily accurate. They were that week's prices for pulled off Curbside. If you go to Curbside and look at HEB, you can pull these off of those, and that's what I've done. I've just pulled those slides off of that and included in this PowerPoint. Again, these prices may change, may not be the same, but it gives you an idea of what the cost is of these different cuts as you look at it. The serving size generally is a 6-ounce serving, is that you're going to try to get that size steak to serve to that person that night. That 6-ounce fresh will cook down to about a 4 or 4.5 ounce steak. So you lose about 20 to 25% of the weight due to moisture loss during cooking and any fat that might drip away. The flank itself is a very, very lean cut. It's in what we would call the lean category, which is any cut that has less than 10% fat. Extra lean would be a cut that would have less than 5% fat. The flank, $8.23. Very likely, unless you're doing some sort of special cooking school with gourmet cooks, you're probably not going to, going towards a gourmet recipe, you're probably not necessarily going to use this method. It does give you an idea of the variety of those. It does give you an idea of the variety of those different cuts. So this is what a flank looks like, and you'll see the steak that was taken out of that. Another one is the flat iron. That's a little more recent, but that's still now probably 10 years we have started hearing about flat iron steaks. In flat irons, they originally were called top blades, and they're from the chuck area of the animal. And the interesting thing about them is they are known to be the second most tender muscle in the entire beef animal. The number 1 most tender is the tenderloin, of course. Tenderloin's a much higher price. You're not going to see those. That's not one of our 6 cuts in this selected group. But the flat iron is very tender, very flavorful, particularly when it's cooked to a medium degree of doneness or less. It gets some livery flavors if you overcook this particular steak. But again, it's very lean. All these steaks are in the lean category with the exception of one that just barely misses that lean category as you go through here. And so it is actually, very high rated, very tender, and the price per pound on this is $6.68 the week that I looked at that, just about a week ago, which is in that time around Labor Day is when I looked at these particular steaks. All right, so when we look at another one is a skirt steak. Skirt steak, of course, as you know, are what we would call our fajitas. Now, a fajita could be anything nowadays. So when you see something on a label that says beef for fajitas, it could come from anywhere in that carcass. It could come from the round cuts, it could come from the shoulder, come from the chuck, come from the loin tails. A lot of time that's what they'll use. It might come from the sirloin. So a fajita, beef for fajitas is really anything. But when you talk about skirt steaks, there's two skirt steaks, and we're going to hone in on really the first one, that probably the more common one that you might use that you'll see in a grocery store, and that is the inside skirt. So here we have three different products, all H-E-B products that are inside skirt. Again, we're not trying to push H-E-B. I'm just trying to use these slides to help teach you. You may go to your local grocery store and buy these different products and talk through them. So the first one you'll see, it says beef inside skirt tenderized, and it's $7.19 a pound. Okay, so when we talk about an inside skirt steak, that is a muscle that comes from the flank plate area, and it has some toughness issues. So sometimes, as you'll notice here, the first one that's presented is an inside skirt steak that's been tenderized. The way that they tenderize it, they put that through a cubing machine. Same machine that they would use for cube steaks. It just scores the outside of the cut on both sides and makes that kind of lines through it that you see as far as that pattern, and it cuts up the outside of the muscle and makes it more tender overall, makes it easier to chew through. It does also create some texture issues sometimes if they overdo that. But that product, if you notice, is $7.19. The regular inside skirt, it says butterfly. All they've done is they've taken the full skirt steak and right down the middle, they've just cut down and then just flipped it out from each other, much like you would do in a butterfly pork chop. So they've taken the full inside skirt, and they've just gone right down lengthwise, right down through it, and they've just opened it up. And that also makes that product more tender when you do that, and you'll notice that price is also $7.19 a pound. And then you might notice you'll see different labels. So what do I buy? That one, this, and the other one is a choice natural beef. Now, the term natural, let's talk about natural. Natural does not mean anything special about how the animal was raised. If you notice, there's going to be an asterisk by that, and if you read the asterisk, it's going to say no preservatives, no additives, and minimally processed. And in fact, all three of these steaks could be labeled natural right now. Has nothing to do with the way the animal's raised. If you do look at the naturally raised one, you'll see it says no antibiotics. Okay, that animal was never given antibiotics. There is no antibiotics in any of this meat, period. So that there's antibiotics in the meat is never an issue, or at least it's rarely an issue, and these steaks do not have that in there. That's tested. The producer is required by law to make sure that that antibiotic has been withdrawn from the animal system before they're allowed to market that animal for food. And so FDA, there's legal issues, there's even a jail term that could happen if they don't do this. And so the Food and Drug Administration has set a withdrawal time on all drugs, and they actually add a margin of safety into that. And so when they do that withdrawal time, that rancher is required to withdraw that animal, make sure it does not go into the human food chain until that antibiotic has been eliminated from the animal system. So what about this antibiotic issues? Well, most of these ranchers will use antibiotics. I think it's inhumane to not treat a sick animal, and this is always under the supervision of a veterinarian. And so if an animal gets sick, of course, they're going to give it an antibiotic that has been approved for the use in that beef animal. Okay? And they're not going to use one that's only for humans. Okay? If it's only humans, that's never going to come into the livestock industry. They only use those that have been specifically identified as being approved for use in cattle. So they'll give that animal that antibiotic to help cure that sickness. And again, there's a withdrawal time before that animal is allowed to go in the human food chain. And so what would a farmer do if an animal got sick? Well, they're going to give that animal an antibiotic, and then they're going to remove it from the rest of the ones that have not had an antibiotic. This animal, they're going to ship it saying never given antibiotics. This one had been given an antibiotic, but again, it's been withdrawn. There's no antibiotics in the meat, period. And so because of that, there's really zero health difference in the meat from those two animals, period. Looked at that, researched that. 100% can stake my reputation on that issue. And so when you look at that, no difference in the healthfulness of any of these meat products that you see in this picture. And that one you'll notice is about $1.70 more per pound, so something to think about. So when we look at skirt steaks, there's really two skirt steaks. The best one is called the outside skirt. but it has a much higher price per pound. The outside skirt is the diaphragm muscle. That's the original fajita. The original fajita that we had was this outside skirt or the diaphragm muscle from the beef animal. The inside skirt was kind of a second best choice because what ended up happening is that diaphragm was actually labeled as a variety meat item, just like a liver. And going into Japan, there were no tariffs on variety meats. And so Japan just bought up all the diaphragms that they could get. It's skeletal muscle, it's meat, but they bought it just because of the way it was labeled and there's no tariffs on that product. And they got used to it and really liked it. And so they still buy a lot of those, even though there's some tariffs on that now. But as it's sold there, because there's such a high demand for it in the Pacific Rim countries, there's such a big demand, not as much supply, it's not a very big cut. That price per pound quite often is $3 to $4 more per pound than the inside skirt. So if you do fajitas, you might, or skirt steak, most likely are going to be using that inside skirt. If you're doing fajitas, we'll talk about another cut that you might seriously consider for your fajitas if you're going to do that type of menu item. All right, so another way that you can buy skirt steaks and any of these meat products is in a vacuum package bag. So there's different ways that you package meats. One is in a vacuum package bag. The other one is what we call an overwrap, PVC overwrap package. What you traditionally would see meat cuts at a grocery store is a overwrap package where it allows the oxygen to go in and out through that film. Because there's oxygen that can go in and out in the normal PVC retail grocery store overwrap, it makes that beef color a bright cherry red color. That's a normal, natural thing. The myoglobin that's naturally in the muscle, it's not hemoglobin, it's myoglobin, it's a protein. When it's exposed to air, it pulls in the oxygen and it allows that meat to bloom to a bright cherry red color. We call that oxygenating and oxymyoglobin. If we take the air away from it, the meat is a purple color. And that's why in a vacuum package bag where we pulled all the air out, sealed the bag tight, then when that happens, that meat is a purple color. But if you were to open up the bag and expose it back to air, you will see it turn into a bright cherry red color. That's kind of a fun thing to do with youth. Just find that and open it up. Or you could just take a roast, like an eye of round roast, and cut a steak. When you pull that steak off, you'll notice that the meat is purple, but the other side of the steak is a bright cherry red color. In a little bit, you'll see that part that was purple blooms to a bright cherry red color. That's a normal, natural process that you see in muscle. The reason that you buy vacuum packaged, it's a larger cut. Usually you can get that for $1 or $2, maybe less per pound, and something to look at if you're going to provide meat for a large group of people. In that vacuum packaged bag, the meat will last quite a bit longer. In the PVC overwrap, that meat will last 3 to maybe 5 days at the most without turning seriously a dark color. But in the vacuum package bag, away from air, that really inhibits the spoilage bacteria from really messing the meat up, messing the color up. And that product quite often will last 21 and sometimes 45, 60 days at refrigerated temperatures in that vacuum package bag. Many people will use that for the aging process and keep it in the vacuum package bag. We call that wet aging, and we'll talk more about that here in just a minute. So another one of the cuts that we're going to have that's presented in the PowerPoint presentation is a ribeye steak. Very flavorful cut. Now this one has about, on a lean basis, USDA says that it's 11 grams in a 100 gram sample. That makes it a little bit more than that lean category, but it is very flavorful and people really like this cut, so that's something you might do. You might notice that this particular day that I looked up these prices, the ribeye steak, when it was bone in, is $3.77 per pound. The boneless product is $9.77 a pound. I just know that in reality, if you were to pull the bone out, that really price per pound would be closer to about $4.50 a pound. You don't get a whole lot of trim loss unless you really see a large bone that's in there that goes around the entire cut. But if just the ribs there, you can probably add about $1 just from that. And so would you get bone in or boneless? Again, I'd look at the price. Leaving that bone in makes it look like a pretty big cut too. You're also paying for that on a weight basis, just know that. So when you put it all together, kind of think through those issues when you're looking at sales. Think about bone, how much they're going to actually consume. And quite often we're going to shoot for that 6-ounce steak. And it's pretty tough to get a 6-ounce steak at a ribeye. But just know that is a very flavorful steak. It has a great flavor. Now, sometimes you'll have something called seam fat. That's the fat between two muscles. And so that's something you can also teach with and say, we're just going to eat the lean portion of this, take into account the waste that you're going to get when you purchase product from the standpoint of removing the rib and removing any of that excess fat. You're not actually going to eat that, so that's something you figure out when you look at the price per pound. That's a teaching moment and something you might consider as you go to the grocery store and look for and see what actually is offered there at the store. Okay, a strip loin. Strip loin is another what we call the middle meats. Those are the more tender areas. This is actually one side of the T-bone and porterhouse steak. A T-bone porterhouse steak has the strip loin on one side and a tenderloin on the other. This is just that tenderloin, that strip loin muscle. It's the long isthmus muscle. Sometimes we call it the loin eye or the ribeye muscle. And that muscle, generally very tender, very flavorful. And as you look at it, you'll see the price per pound. On the prime product here is $15.44, and on the select product, $9.45. Quite often you can find this particular cut on sale at many of the different grocery stores through the year, so something to always look for. The last cut that we want to talk about is the sirloin, the top sirloin. Top sirloin is a very tender muscle. You'll see that. It's another middle meat. It's probably of tenderness, it's probably 4th or 5th in the ranking of tenderness. It's not as good as the strip loin, it's not as good as a ribeye, definitely not as good as the tenderloin or flat iron, but it's kind of in that category. And as you look at that cut, you'll notice that the price per pound is in that $6 to $7 range. This is one of those cuts that you'll quite often see on sale. So this one probably very likely is one that you may very often use in your steak programs that you may do as far as from a grilling standpoint. The flat iron and this particular steak are probably the most common ones that I've seen used in these grilling one-on-one programs. This one is called the top sirloin. You'll notice the other one that's a little bit more expensive does not have what we call the cap muscle. Cap muscle is a little less tender, and if with the price difference that you see here, I definitely would buy the cap off ones and just utilize that. It's a lot easier to cut steaks when you do that into that 6-ounce. So what you do is you take the steak, if you cut it into 3 sections, each of these steaks, it would pretty much be very close to a 6 to 8-ounce steak, probably 6-ounce, very likely. Again, you're looking at the weight, looking at the cut. And so $6.99, that's fairly doable. If you cut that per pound and you're going to cut it, even if you just cut it in 2, now we're going from $6.99 to basically $3.50 per steak per person. So the cost of these meals, you have to kind of figure that out. We're kind of estimating that, overall you probably ought to be charging at least $15 to $20 per person for this grilling program. You can charge a lot more. What I've learned is you kind of look at your audience and determine what they can pay. But quite often you can get $20, $25 for a meal when you have a steak in that particular grilling 101. But again, that's all up to you. You guys have a better idea of your clientele and what they can afford and can't. So you have to buy the meat products that fit appropriately. So I do want to just finish up with a couple questions that you may get. The first one is on aging. So aging is actually a natural phenomenon that happens in a meat cut, particularly those middle meats. You don't see aging in briskets. You don't see aging in some of the round cuts because what causes that to become tough or tender is based on connective tissue. This is actually based on the actual tenderness of the muscle fibers themselves. And as meat, particularly the middle meats, which would be the ribeye, the strip, the top sirloin, even to some extent the flat iron, over time that product will become more tender because just naturally, there's enzymes just naturally in the muscle that kind of eats itself up. And so here we have a picture of a muscle that's, we look at an electron microscope about 1 day after the animal's been harvested. And if you look at about 35 days later, as far as aging, you'll notice that that muscle has really kind of disintegrated. And you can imagine it's a lot easier to chew through the one that's been aged for 35 days than the one that looks very dense and has lots of its structure still in place. When we look at aging as a kind of a curve, so that meat will begin to age very quickly. It'll become more tender after a couple of days. And after 7 days, you'll see significant tenderness. This is after harvest. In 14 days, you'll start to see it starting to slow down. And here we have just a slide that shows select, which is the solid line. And then we see the premium choice or higher choice products. That's the dotted line. You notice, first of all, the premium choice starts more tender. Both of them get in the tender range fairly quickly, and particularly after about 14 days, they're both in that tender range. On average, through some research that we've done in my group, the group that I work with, the National Beef Tenderness Survey, we found on average the meat product at retail is going to be somewhere between 19 to 20 days post-harvest when it reaches the grocery store. By the time it gets from the processing facility through the distribution center to the retail grocery store, it takes about 19 to 20, 24, 5 days. And so aging is not that big a deal. Now, there are people that buy the larger cuts and they'll age them in the refrigerator for 7 days. I encourage the people only that age only in vacuum packaged bags at refrigerated temperatures. Do not leave meat outside. Outside. Get it at home as quickly as you can and keep it in your refrigerator. Do not put meat out on the counter. That will create some food safety issues as you go forward. So we never recommend that you leave meat out on the table or on the kitchen shelves. But we do encourage you to make sure you keep it in the refrigerator and get it refrigerated and keep it cool as much as possible. So not all meat ages at the same levels, and there's some cuts that we don't even want to age, like a brisket. We don't need to age briskets. Okay, aging briskets does not do anything. Cooking briskets appropriately is what makes that meat more tender. In fact, we've determined that you have to get the internal temperature to about 195 degrees Fahrenheit on briskets. You have to get that meat about 195 degrees Fahrenheit in order to make the connective tissue in the muscle turn to jelly, basically, gelatin, and that will create a fairly tender product when you cook that low and slow for a long period of time. That's the difference between a brisket and a strip loin. Strip loin aging works, brisket it does not. So one other term that people are going to ask you about, what about dry aging versus wet aging? What in the world are they talking about? Well, dry aging is aging in open air when that meat has contact with the air itself and is hanging in a cooler in open air. Wet aging is aging in a vacuum packaged bag. And I will tell you there's zero difference in tenderness and juiciness between aging in a open air and aging in a vacuum packaged bag. Again, both of those are in a refrigerator in our walk-in cooler when they're being aged. So here's an example. If you look at two products, the top picture is a picture of a cooler with a whole host of strip loins that are being dry aged. If you notice in the bottom picture, you'll see one that's in a bag. That's in a vacuum, airtight package, and that meat will last without much loss for at least 45 to 60 days in that vacuum packaged bag at refrigerated temperatures. And so both of them will age at a very similar rates. The only real difference that you'll see between dry aging and wet aging is some flavor differences, and they're fairly subtle flavor differences. But if you look at this slide, it really shows you, different flavors across the bottom. You have beefy, bloody surmy, brown roasted, metallic, and sour. You'll notice that the orange color is dry aged, the red color is vacuum aged, and unaged is the green. And so you'll see not big differences, but there are subtle differences where we look at the good flavors, which is beefy. You notice dry aged is slightly higher in a beefy flavor, slightly higher in brown roasted flavor. Also, dry aged is slightly lower in bloody surimi and metallic and sour. Not big differences, but enough differences for people that are really connoisseurs of beef, they can tell. Generally, the average consumer cannot tell the difference between dry aged and wet aged beef. All right, the main issue about dry aged versus wet aged is yield loss. So you'll notice here we have ribeye steaks, and this is the yield of steaks from a primal wholesale cut. It's a big cut. They'll cut it into steaks. And you'll notice that those products that are dry aged, you might lose as much as 30% of the weight of the cuts, where you only lose about 12% in a wet aged product. So dry aging, the outside of it turns crusty. Sometimes you'll even get some mold growth, and you're going to have to trim all of that off. Underneath that, it's fairly sterile, and it's not really an issue, but you have to trim a lot of it off to get down to what's left over. That outside will dehydrate, and you'll get this crust around the outside of it, and that's a yield loss. And that's why most people do not go to dry aging, let alone just the energy that it takes to hold that product in open air for a long period of time. So, last thing we want to talk about is the nutritional elements. So, all 6 of the cuts that you have, we have put in a folder the USDA NutriFacts for that particular cut of meat. And full report. So if somebody wants to know what fatty acids are in that, what amino acids, and how much zinc and how much iron, there is a full composition that's in for each one of these steaks that's in that folder that you can use. So what we've used, and what I would recommend that you use from a nutritional data standpoint, is separable lean only, because we're going to encourage people to only eat the lean part. All grades for most cuts. Some steaks you can find difference between select and choice and prime. They're there in that database, but generally using all grades work. And then cooked and broiled. That's about as close as we're going to get to grilling. So that's generally the NutriFacts that you see in here. And you're going to see in this, you'll see all the different macronutrients. You'll see, the water and the calories and the protein and the lipids that you'll see in the product. You'll also see all the different minerals and the vitamins and the amino acids and the fatty acid profile of these different cuts. So that's all there. In addition to that, if you want to find that, you'll Google just USDA nutrient data. You'll come up and it'll say food composition, type in a name, look up standard reference. So there's different types of data that's there. There's industry presented data. But USDA has worked with actually Texas A&M University, somewhat out of Texas Tech, and we have developed a standard reference for all of these cuts for USDA under their supervision. So all the data that you're going to see for beef predominantly has come out of Texas A&M University and our meat science group that we have here that I've worked with over the last many years. In addition to that, if you Google USDA ground beef calculator, you'll find a calculator where you can plug in different numbers and come up with a specific ground beef that you are going to use for a particular event. We've offered you just one specific one, but you can find 95%, 90%, you can find 87%, 85%. You can also look at different cooking methods such as crumbles or loaf, like a meatloaf or a pan broiled or a patty pan broiled, patty broiled, or even a raw product, and the nutritional data for each one of those. So there's a whole host of nutritional information that you can get. Let's talk a little bit more about ground beef. There's a video, if you go to this particular site, which is linked in another folder here within the agent website. But if you look at that, it'll talk about ground beef. You can even show this particular video, just like you could show that calibrating video that Dr. Griffin did. But in this particular video, it talks about the nutrition elements and then also selection of ground beef products. So let's go through a little bit of what that says in that video. First of all, let me ask you a couple of questions. Number one is, what is better, ground round, ground sirloin, or ground chuck? Well, the answer to that is it depends. How much fat is in each one of those? It doesn't matter whether it comes from the sirloin or the round or the chuck. All of that is beef. It all is essentially the same in the amount of calories and fat and all the macronutrients, as well as many of the fatty acids, amino acids in that product. Very little difference depending on where it comes from. What matters is what percent fat does it say on the package. Ground round is not necessarily better than ground sirloin. Okay, they both could have 15% fat. That would be identical. That product would, from a nutritional standpoint, would be identical. Just one would be the trimmings that come from when they cut round steaks. They'll take the trimmings from that and they'll make ground round. Sirloin, they'll do the same thing, cut it into those top sirloin steaks. If there's trimmings left, they'll grind that and make that into ground sirloin. Same thing with chuck. Just regular ground beef are the trimmings from all the different parts of the animal, all the different parts of the carcass. As that meat is collated together, then they look at the percent fat in that product, and they'll add some fat or add some lean, a lean source, to make the final percent fat that they want for a particular ground beef product. So when we look at specific areas of the carcass, there's not necessarily one better than another. What you really look at is what is the percent fat on the package. Now, how are most ground beef products made? Well, they generally have a lean source and a fat source of beef. So a lean beef source and a fat beef source, and they blend those two things together to come up with the percent fat that they want for a particular ground beef product. So they might actually, just use actually the same raw materials to come up with a 15% ground beef or a 20% ground beef or a 25% fat ground beef product. So, but what they do is they just add different amount of lean and different amount of fat to come up with that exact percentage. And they cannot go past that. They can't have more fat than what it says. They can have less, but they can't have more fat. So here's an example of a slide that has two different products at the top. If you notice, they're both 85% lean. One says natural Angus, the other one says ground round. They're both the same amount of fat inside of those products, same amount of lean. Nutritionally, no difference in those. In fact, from a health standpoint, they are both exactly the same as far as safety and healthfulness. The word natural, again, means minimally processed, no additives or preservatives. In this case, they also put the word no antibiotics. We've already explained that. It's not a big deal. No difference. There's no antibiotics in this meat, period. Okay, that's not the issue. And secondly, when you look at the overall healthfulness and safety, they're exactly the same. Now you'll see another package that says lean ground beef, and it says 93% fat, or 93% lean, 7% fat. It's a very lean product. You'll see another one that says 96% lean, 4% fat. Notice one says extra lean. That's the one that has less than 5% fat, and the one says lean. Any product that says less than 10% fat, USDA says you can use the term lean. Again, what is the healthfulness? Keep in mind that if you're going to make a patty, like we'll do in this, much of that fat will drip away. And so the overall fat content will be less. This is the fat content in a raw ground beef patty. It will be lower when you look at the final product. If you make a 4-ounce patty, again, you're going to lose 25% of its weight. So you're going to end up with a 3-ounce patty, and that's why you'll see a lot of data reported on the 3-ounce beef portion, because you start out with a 1/4 pound, you cook it down, you end up with 3 ounces. Something to keep in mind as you look at the nutritional data that you might use. So when we look at how they make ground beef comes from all the different, what we call skeletal muscle cuts from a carcass. Okay, all the different, they don't use, byproducts in there. If they did, they have to say that on the label. Okay, it's only those muscles that you see in this animal. So the trimmings from when they cut out all the other steaks and roasts, and whatever trimmings are left over, they'll use that for ground beef. In addition to that, they'll use the lean from a cull or a market cow or bull. Those that have outlived their usefulness for breeding purposes, they'll harvest those. And those are very lean. That's generally quite often the lean source. And then they'll mix that with the fat from a feed yard steer to give it the flavor, and they'll blend those two together to the percent fat that they want for that particular ground beef blend. So last thing we want to talk about when we talk about burgers is now, you hear a lot about plant-based burgers. And this is one example, the Impossible Burger. I read an article in Business Edition today that actually Burger King, when they presented Impossible Burgers, they didn't know this, but they actually have increased the amount of Whoppers, the regular Whoppers that they have sold as well. So they are selling these, but they're also selling even more Whoppers than what they did before. So what's in this Impossible Burger? So let's look at an ingredient list, and I got this from the website of Impossible Burger. And you'll see, first of all, if you just looked at a ground beef patty, the regular ones, it just says beef. And if you look at this beef alternative, the Impossible Burger, you'll also see that it has a whole host of things. Of course, it doesn't have any beef in it, but it does have, in this case, the first ingredient's water. Well, that's not a big deal. It's fairly high in water, higher than regular beef. Beef would be 70% water. This is probably much higher, 85, 90% water. Soy protein concentrate, coconut oil, sunflower oil, natural flavors, which we're not exactly sure what those are, but those are all approved by USDA. And then it uses things like protein from potatoes, methylcellulose, yeast extract, cultured dextrose, that's a sweetener, food starch modified, and then you have soy products, some more soy products. You try to mimic the vitamin content of beef, and so now they're adding tocopherol, which is a vitamin E. You'll see zinc in there. Unfortunately, that's not as absorbable. The zinc from meat is 3 to 5 times more absorbable than the zinc out of plant sources. There's some iron things mixed in here, a whole source of things trying to get back to where beef is. That's why I call beef a nutrient accumulator. Just through their life, they accumulate that. And there's even vitamin B12, and I'm not sure the source that comes from because that's only found in ruminant animals. But maybe they have a synthetic source, I don't know. So when you look at that, remember, anytime you look at list of ingredients, it's in the order of most prevalence within that cut. So another one that you'll hear about is the Beyond Burger. So here we have what the ingredients are for Beyond Burger. So again, this is a very high processed food. Now there's nothing necessarily wrong with any of these. I just think it's important for people to understand exactly how these are put together. And so generally you're going to see a protein source, and you're going to have some oil put in there for flavoring. And then you're going to mix natural flavors and coloring in there. You're going to add some sort of starch to kind of hold it together. Methylcellulose, you notice this one has a cellulose from bamboo. Again, that's to give the meat, this beef alternative, a texture somewhat like meat. So all of these things are put together to try to help make an alternative for people to eat. And in reality, I think it'd just be really good to help them necessarily, buy the packages out of the store and talk about the ingredient label. You don't have to use these slides. Don't use these slides. Just use what you actually find in the store and talk through the ingredient labels for these different foods. So I hope I've given you some ideas and things to think about as you're working on putting together your Grilling 101 workshop or whatever you're going to put together from a Grilling 101 standpoint. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak with you, and I really feel like when we really thought up and started to develop this idea, here's an opportunity for us to all within the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension group to work together as a team to help present health and nutrition, food safety, and agriculture and path to the plate type messages. And so thank you, and I appreciate your efforts. You all are definitely our feet on the ground, and I know will help us forward this program. So have a great day, and thank you so much.